The influence of psychology is all around us. It touches everything we feel, everything we think, and everything we do.
Psychologists pervade every aspect of human experience. For example, sports psychologists. Boxers are taught self-hypnosis that's directed by a psychologist. Psychologists are involved in politics, in designing advertising campaigns.
In fact, the tools of psychology have been used to influence us in many ways. From who we vote for, to how we behave, and even the products that we buy.
1, 0, and liftoff.
Even in outer space, the astronauts are studied by psychologists to what task should you be asked to do, what task should you not be asked to do.
Psychologists provide tools that we all use every day to better understand ourselves, relate to other people, and live healthier, happier lives.
How is it that you can work out relations with others? In close relationships with best friends or girlfriends and boyfriends, and then over the lifespan, friends at school, colleagues at work, eventually children. All of that's the province of psychology.
But there was a time, not so long ago, when the field of psychology didn't exist, and nobody questioned why we as individuals behave the way we do. The 1600s marked a period of great scientific discovery in Europe. Sir Isaac Newton had just discovered gravity, and Galileo had come to realize that the Earth was not the center of the universe. And a new invention called the mechanical clock had just been unveiled. For scientists, this technological wonder became a metaphor for the universe, a great machine that was mechanically determined and easily explained. Similarly, the human mind was thought to be as precise and predictable as a clock. Surely it was only a matter of time before scientists would find a way to peer inside and watch its gears and levers at work. There they would find a simple scientific explanation for all human behavior. For 200 years, this concept remained untested. And then in the 19th century, the first psychologists entered their labs and the science of psychology was born. In 1879, a German researcher, Wilhelm Wundt, set out to apply scientific methods to the study of the mind. Like a chemist, he hoped to break down mental processes into their basic elements. Using simple brass instruments, he measured things like vision, hearing, and reaction time.
Wilhelm Wundt was trying to see what would happen when you, for example, drop a ball on a platform. How much time would occur between the bouncing of that ball and the subject's hitting a telegraph key saying he or she heard that ball. And by using various objects, various stimuli, trying to get these reaction time responses, the science of psychology was born.
But there was a problem. Wundt's experimental psychology was confined to the laboratory. His observations and detailed descriptions didn't help solve any real-world problems.
Psychology had to find its place amongst established sciences, biology, physics, chemistry. And in those sciences, they had demonstrated that the principles derived from the lab had practical applications to everyday life. So in the chemistry department, they could make a better soap. In the biology department, they could build a better chicken. Psychology had to show that it had something to offer.
At the same time, a completely different kind of psychology was emerging in Vienna. It was there that a young doctor began investigating a cure for a mysterious disease called hysteria. His name was Sigmund Freud. Hysteria had become a popular diagnosis for patients, mostly women, who exhibited strange symptoms that had no known medical cause.
Some people would have symptoms all of a sudden of going blind when physically there was nothing wrong with their sight. Going deaf, there was nothing wrong with their hearing. Being paralyzed, having an arm that wouldn't move, a leg that wouldn't move. But in physical examination would not reveal that there was any organic medical problem that would explain the condition.
Doctors had attributed hysteria to a variety of causes, including promiscuity and neurological problems. But Freud believed the roots of hysteria were psychological. He was convinced that his patients were being affected by traumatic experiences from their past that were so painful they had repressed them. Somehow, from deep in their unconscious, these unresolved issues were causing their physical symptoms. Freud's treatment was simple but effective.
What Freud and some of his colleagues found was that by simply talking to people, that oftentimes they would begin to have some recollection of events that were particularly traumatic, and that by talking about them, either consciously or under hypnosis, that those symptoms would disappear.
The idea that psychological problems could cause physical symptoms was radical. But even more radical was the idea that the mind is not entirely conscious and rational.
He's really the one who proposed that consciousness is just the tip of the iceberg, and that, all the rest is really what makes us fall in love, get depressed, make life-changing decisions, and sometimes not be able to function at all. And this idea of the unconscious, however revolutionary it was at the time, is very much accepted by everyone in the Western world.
Freud called his practice psychoanalysis and touted it as an important new science. But the medical community had a hard time accepting that definition. Many thought Freud's approach relied too heavily on speculation rather than on scientific method. How could Freud hope to prove the existence of the unconscious when it was impossible to see or measure? And so, at the turn of the century, both branches of psychology were struggling for acceptance. Wilhelm Wundt and his colleagues had scientific method, but no real-world problems to solve. And Sigmund Freud was treating real patients with real problems, but his approach was deemed too unscientific to be believed. All of that would soon change. In 1914, Europe went to war. 3 years later, the United States began mobilizing troops and was faced with a huge challenge.
Here you have a nation going to war. Here you have over 1 million young men coming to serve. And the question is, who's going to do what? Who's going where? What are they going to do? And how do you figure that out? And psychologists were there with a ready hand. One of the things that psychology did have to offer was measurement of mind. So they formed a unit for classifying recruits. One of the beginnings was the assessment of intelligence.
Building on the tests developed by Wilhelm Wundt and his followers, psychologists devised the first large-scale IQ tests. And by war's end, the military had administered the test to nearly 1 million recruits.
Alongside tests of intelligence were tests of aptitude and ability. So who might be good in the machine shop? Who might be good driving a truck? Who might be a good foot soldier? These were the kinds of things that the military needed to quickly mobilize a fighting force. It promoted efficiency and was considered, all in all, a great success for American psychology.
But it wasn't just Wundt's brand of psychology that was given a role to play. Some of Sigmund Freud's theories would also be called to duty. As World War I dragged on, thousands of soldiers began coming back from the front lines with mysterious symptoms like paralysis, blindness, and stuttering. Initially, doctors assumed the soldiers had a physical condition caused by their repeated exposure to heavy artillery, and they named this new disease shell shock. When no physical cause for the symptoms was discovered, shell shock was redefined as a form of male hysteria. Finally, psychologists were called in. In time, Freud's talking therapy got thousands of shell-shocked soldiers back on their feet. The results suggested that Freud's theories were more plausible than some had believed. By the end of World War I, psychology had gained new credibility in the eyes of the American public. But with that popularity came controversy. In the 1920s, the military published the results from their IQ tests. The findings stirred a national debate.
Some of the findings were, for example, that the average American male had the mental age of, I think, a 12 or 13-year-old. The data was read to say that Southerners were not as intelligent as Northerners, and African Americans were less intelligent than whites. It reinforced stereotypes, particularly against African Americans, that were very long-standing and difficult to overcome.
Only later would experts come to realize that the tests were biased towards the men who had created them, white, Northern, and college-educated. But for the moment, the results were considered highly scientific and the damage was done. At a time when there were already concerns about the growing number of immigrants flooding the country, the data only heightened fears. Some wondered if this surge in minorities would taint the nation's gene pool. Out of these concerns grew a new social movement that set up rigid genetic standards and encouraged only those who met a particular genetic ideal to reproduce. It was called eugenics.
Those people that believed we were born with our intelligence believed that either you had it or you didn't. Eugenics developed programs and a philosophy of encouraging the fit to reproduce and working to find sanctions against those who are less mentally fit from reproducing.
But who decides who's mentally fit?
The feeble-minded child is also a problem to the community. He must be taught in special classes for the retarded. He continues.
The members of the eugenics movement took it upon themselves to decide.
These children are also a social problem. They are easily led into delinquency, and if not rigidly supervised, are likely to marry and reproduce their kind.
So we get into difficult issues, sterilization. And in fact, there were institutions in America that routinely sterilized those who were deemed to be mentally defective.
But for a growing number of psychologists, the key to creating a more mentally fit America lay not in people's genes, but in their environment. The behaviorists, as they were called, were convinced that by careful scientific observation, they could find ways to understand and control human behavior.
These men were very concerned, now not with plumbing the depths of the human mind, as Freud was, but with really trying to understand how it is that behavioral patterns are built.
These psychologists believed that human beings and animals shared similar patterns of behavior and learning.
To analyze this conflict behavior more conveniently than can usually be done with human subjects, we use simpler organisms under controlled laboratory conditions.
The early behaviorists really came out of that tradition of studying animal behavior and animal learning. And what do we share in common with animals?
A key figure in this movement was a psychologist named B.F. Skinner, who believed that behavior could be shaped by a system of rewards.
In this glass box, a hungry pigeon has already learned that when he pecks at the disc, food as reinforcement appears briefly in the food trough below the disc. Now, we are going to vary the schedule of reinforcement and observe what happens to the pigeon's behavior.
In this experiment, scientists were trying to determine what minimum reward would produce maximum performance.
We will begin with a schedule of feeding which we call fixed ratio reinforcement. We've started this bird on a schedule of reinforcement for every 5th peck on the disc. The more pecking he does, the more food he receives.
They're really focused on stimulus that you present to an organism and the response that the organism gives. but you kind of ignore the whole middle part about how the mind works and the way information is processed in the mind.
I do this demonstration in my classes. You simply take a hungry pigeon with a food dispenser and ask the class what they want to see the pigeon do. And in a few minutes, usually no more than 2 or 3, I can have the pigeon pacing a figure 8 or bowing to the audience.
4,700 responses, and still at it.
Skinner showed through his psychology of behaviorism how you can condition a pigeon to do just about anything. And he said that those principles used to teach animals to do things were the same principles that governed human learning and behavior.
The children are now on a fixed ratio reinforcement. In other words, the sooner the children finish their assignment, the sooner they will get their reinforcement, in the form of being given a free period for activity of their own choosing.
I could make a pigeon a high achiever by reinforcing it on a certain schedule, and I can make a child a high achiever by reinforcing it on a given schedule.
Skinner was influential in taking some of these ideas and fostering the development of workplaces, of schools, of institutions that took into account the behaviorist ideas.
He developed schedules of pay for assembly line workers. Do you pay them by the hour or by the token, by the piece that they do?
All done.
The behaviorists provided the perfect counterpoint to the eugenics movement. They painted a picture of a world where anyone can achieve anything if they are given the right incentives.
To many people, the promise of America, a society based on the idea that it's a level playing field and that we all have a chance to make of it what we want, that we're determined by what we decide to do, not predetermined by birth.
Off she goes to get her reinforcement.
What we've learned since is that people are really quite different, of course, from rats and other non-human animals, and that although some principles of learning are universal, others aren't. Others are species-specific, and so we've learned to be more cautious.
While Americans were exploring new ways to improve behavior, a rising political leader in Germany was promoting a new extreme form of eugenics, one with horrifying consequences. During World War II, Adolf Hitler would order the systematic annihilation of more than 6 million Jews, gypsies, homosexuals, and the mentally and physically disabled. In the years that followed, the world struggled to come to terms with the Holocaust, and so too would psychologists.
Social scientists were very much interested, confused, and concerned about how such a horrible event could occur. How could human beings be so cruel to other human beings? And it was a fair question.
When tried for their crimes, most of Hitler's lieutenants argued that they were just following orders. But why would someone obey orders when it meant inflicting pain on another person? Would the average human being abandon their moral code that easily? These questions inspired one psychologist to undertake what would become a groundbreaking experiment.
In the late 1960s, Dr. Stanley Milgram, then at Yale University, did some of the most frightening, threatening experiments in the history of psychology. He was concerned with, as everybody was, the rise and fall of the Third Reich, of Hitler, how he came to power, how he held that power, how he got innocent people to follow his dictates to do harm to other innocent people. So Dr. Milgram did a series of studies on what he called blind obedience to authority.
All right, now let me explain to you, learner, exactly what's going to happen and what you're supposed to do.
He would bring 2 participants into the laboratory under the guise of a learning experiment. One of them was going to be the teacher, the other one was going to be the learner.
You are to try to remember each.
The learner was going to have to learn a string of words, and the teacher would actually deliver an electrical shock to the learner every time the learner didn't remember the word.
All right, teacher, would you take the test and be seated in front of the shock generator, please, in the next room?
The teacher is seated in front of a shock generator, a rather impressive-looking instrument. Its main characteristic is 30 switches ranging in voltage from 15 volts to 450 volts in 15-volt increments.
Cloud, horse, rock, house. Answer. Wrong. 150 volts. Answer, horse.
Oh. Experiment. That's all. Get me out of here. I told you I had heart trouble. My heart's starting to bother me now. Get me out of here, please.
Continue, please. Go right on.
I refuse to go on. Let me out.
He refuses to go on.
The experiment requires you continue, teacher. Please continue.
I started with a question, a rather simple question. How far would a person go when asked by authority to carry out orders that conflict with conscience?
Go on, teacher.
In reality, the learner was an actor pretending to receive the shocks that the teacher was administering.
I don't get no answer. He was hollering for less voltage. Can't you check in to see if he's all right, please?
Not once we've started. Please continue, teacher.
Cool, day, shade, water.
What's most striking to us is not necessarily that people forget words. What's striking to us is that people will go give these electrical shocks to another participant just because an experimenter is instructing them to do so.
Continue, please.
I'm up to 390.
Continue.
Psychologists predicted that of the first 40 subjects that were tested, only 0.5% would deliver the full range of shocks. But in fact, the results were far more dramatic.
65% of the sample of these volunteers went to the end of the board and gave 450 volts of shock to an innocent person in the next room. These people will blindly follow an authority's word as long as the orders were perceived as coming from an authority. What we as psychologists have begun to realize is that the power of the situation in terms of our doing evil is sometimes much more powerful than our personalities. Most people, when describe this thing, I wouldn't be like that. But you never know until you're in that situation.
In the decades since Stanley Milgram's experiments, psychologists have developed increasingly sophisticated ways to study human behavior. And the field of psychology has grown to include hundreds of thousands of professionals with a vast array of specialties.
They range from clinical psychology, community psychology, child psychology, the psychology of the aged, perception, learning, motivation, biopsychology, women's studies, any endeavor that humans are involved with as a psychologist looking at that behavior.
For example, advances in brain imaging techniques now allow psychologists to directly observe mental activity as it happens. Much as scientists in the 1600s had imagined, we can now literally look inside the human mind and watch it work.
We can take measurements of someone who's thinking certain thoughts, hearing certain things, viewing certain materials, and we can look at which brain regions are relatively activated as they do each of these tasks.
By directly observing the brain at work, even Sigmund Freud's theories about the unconscious are being validated.
Through careful experimentation, we can show that a participant may, for example, unbeknownst to them, be biased towards men, be biased towards a certain ethnic group, and so on. And that doesn't sound like it's Freudian, but it does, in many ways, go back to this idea that there are things inside of us that influence our behavior and that can crop up without us realizing.
The human organism can't be understood at any one level. One simply can't only look at what someone says, or what someone's brain might be doing at a certain point, or what their childhood might have been like, or what their family environment might have been like. One has to consider all of this together.
As society has undergone dramatic change, the field of psychology has had to keep pace. With every emerging social issue and every new human endeavor comes an opportunity for psychologists to explore and enhance our understanding of one of the most complex systems in nature, the human mind.
This science isn't done in a vacuum. Psychologists are concerned with human welfare. And I think that's a tradition that I'm proud of. I think that's something that keeps a lot of us going. A lot of territory has been charted, but it's still a science in its infancy. And there's much, much more to know and much, much more to discover.